it in school where you get a grade on it and you have to do all of it, and it just doesn't mean as much when you go into it willingly and openly and excited and having to prepare something to communicate to everybody. But the idea of what we've been able to achieve by listening, by studying the Word and applying it, kind of not just taking it for what it is, but also for what it means to the New Testament. We've seen a lot of parallels between what happened under the old law and what we understand under the law of Christ, and I think that's what's made the study of a great deal more interesting and a little bit more profitable for us. We're not just reading some dead, dry history of the old law. It's all of it was a shadow of things to come, and we are living in what is to come. We're now living in what was foretold through the old law. So. But let's finish, let's go back to chapter 26, and then we'll finish up chapter 26, and then we'll get into 27. 27 is kind of like an addendum. It's an add-on to the end of it. It's not like the rest of it where it flows into it, but there's some postscripts that basically God wanted to make sure that Moses put into the law. But in chapter 26, hang on, let me get back up here. Yeah, chapter 26. We got down. We went down through. What did we get an understanding of? We actually may get out here a little earlier tonight because we've gone through most of chapter 26 anyway. What did we read about in chapter 26? What is God? Basically God has done what for the children of Israel? He's given what to them? What's that? Yeah, okay, yeah, He's given manna. The Word of God is, of course, manna. But what has He done? What has He given? What has He given them? He's given them the laws. Now, the laws, and the law was important because remember, the law was holy, and they were holy by obeying the law. Holiness was not imparted to them other than through the law. Much in the same way today, we are holy, we are set apart. Why? Because we're under the law of Christ. They were holy people because they had the law of Moses. So let's go back up in chapter 26 in verse 3. And this is the crux of it all. This is where the rubber hits the road. He's given them all of these things. He's told them how they were to worship, what they were to sacrifice, where they were to sacrifice, and when. They've told them how they were to keep their the laws, not only in their obedience to Him, but also in their dealings with one another. Okay, all of these things were under the law. Their religious laws as well as their secular laws were all still under the law of Moses. So He tells them exactly how they needed to do all things, what they needed to do, their marriage arrangements, their ownership of certain properties, in their dealings with one another. All of these things have all been enumerated at this point. This is what you're to do. Now remember, He gave them the law before they came into the land. And we see that several times. So that when you come into the land, you know what to do. When you come into the land, you're able to immediately begin worshiping Me in the way that you're supposed to, and the way you're dealing with one another. So He tells them all of these things. And I've said this 100 times, and you're probably tired of hearing it, but I'm going to say it again. God has always told us what we need to know. He's never left us hanging. He's never left us wondering, well, what are we supposed to do with this situation? He always tells us what we need to know. Here He's given Moses all of these laws, and those were to be given specific instruction to the priests, specific instruction to the high priest, and specific instructions to the congregation of Israel. So He's given them all of these things. Then, yes. Continuing on. Yeah. This is what you're to do. Now, exactly. He's always told them what they're supposed to do. Now, once again, this is where the rubber meets the road. I've given you all of these things. I've told you all that you need to know. In verse 3 of chapter 26, and we talked about this last week, we'll go through it very quickly. Blessings. Chapter 26, verse 3, beginning. If ye walk in My statutes and keep My commandments. All right. There's the unilateral contract that God is giving to us. Here's the conditions. It's up to you whether to accept it or reject it. That's it. If ye walk in My statutes and you keep My commandments and do them, then, and then he enumerates the blessings that they will receive if they continue in his commandments. You notice that many of the blessings are physical blessings. Yet they receive, of course, spiritual blessings. They will be close to God. They will remain in a covenant relationship with him. But he also enumerates several physical blessings that they will receive. And what are those? Then, I will give your rains in their season. So he's promising them. Now, why would rains be an essential thing? Why give you the rains in their season? Well, what's the big deal about that? Okay, so when they planted the harvest, guess what? You plant a harvest in the Middle East, and you don't have rain on it, what's going to happen to it? Anywhere, really. What's going to happen to that? It's going to be parched. We've been watching, the girls have been watching Little House on the Prairie. And one of the big things that's consistent all the way through that was the worry. They were all farmers. And the big worry was, are we going to have rain? Is there going to be a drought? What are we going to do? If water didn't come from the sky and it didn't flow down through so we could irrigate it and we can divert it and water the crops are going to die. All right? So there's a cascade effect, right? The rains don't come, so the crop doesn't arise. So what happens then? The crops don't come up. You can't sell. You can't pay your bills. You can't sell the crop and pay your bills. What else? You'll starve to death. Now, see, nowadays, we don't, in this country, we really don't think about the idea of starvation. I mean, to starve in this country almost takes an effort to starve in this, because you can find food. There's so many places that you can go and find food. Back then, there wasn't that. If they didn't eat, they starved. If they didn't grow the crops, if the crops didn't come up, or the crops failed, there was a very, very real potential of genuine starvation. I mean, people starving in their homes. And we read about that, and we'll talk about that more here in a minute. So, he says, I'll give you rains in your season. This is a physical blessing that they absolutely had to have in order for their crops to come up so that they could feed themselves and not go hungry. All right. Then I will give you the rains in their seasons, and the land shall yield its increase, stemming from the rains. It's like the old scripture says, Lord sends the rain on the just and the unjust. That's not a curse of rain. That's a blessing of rain. So even the evil had the rains come on their crops. But when the children of Israel didn't obey God, the rains didn't come in their seasons, and everybody starved. Okay. I will give you the rains in their seasons. The land shall yield its increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. All right, that's one. Then, and your threshing shall reach unto the vintage, and the vintage shall reach unto the sowing time. So what is he saying here? You'll have enough food to last. Yeah, not only will you eat when the crops come up, but everything that you put to the side, everything that you store up, will last you until you get next year. And it goes to the idea of heaping up for ourselves. And the parable that Jesus spoke about, the man who stored up all of his stuff for himself. One of the problems with that man was he didn't give credit to where credit was due, and it showed that he no longer relied on the generosity of God to provide for himself. I will store up stuff in my barns. And it showed that his heart was far away from trusting in God. If you trust in God, God's going to provide. And here he enumerates that he will do just that. So he said, once you reap the harvest, you'll subside on what you have, and there will be enough left to continue on, and it will carry over until the next year. So I'll always provide for you. And your threshing shall reach unto the vintage shall reach unto the sowing time, and ye shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land safely. And I will give peace in the land. So here's another blessing. I'll give peace in the land. What does it mean by peace? Hey. Sorry, I'm just going here with the baby. There's brand new parents right there. Just ask them about it. All right. So you will dwell in your land safely. So what does that mean? Peaceably. What does that mean? What is he promising them here? There's not going to be strife. Are they going to have to worry about when God cast out the inhabitants of Canaan, he slaughtered many of them. As he told the Israelites to go in, destroy them utterly. Man, woman, child, everybody's to be destroyed. Some he did not. Some he merely cast out. Some he allowed to remain as captives of the Israelites so that they would have servants, and they didn't have to do a lot of the menial work. They had slaves, servants of the nations that were living there to do that work for them. But when he cast those people out of the land of Canaan, and they dwelt outside of the borders of Israel, Did those people just sort of accept their lot in life and say, you know what, we had it for a period of time, it was great, but it's not really that big of a deal? What did the people who used to live in Canaan, who are now living outside of Canaan, or living outside of what's now Israel, what are they doing? They wanted back in. They didn't accept the will of the Lord. They still wanted to get back into Canaan. They still wanted to get back to their homelands. They wanted back all of their lands, their houses, all of their fields, everything that they had to give up when they were thrown out of the land. They wanted back in. So what did they constantly do? They made war against Israel. They would send in raiding parties into some of the outskirts. They would take away captives. Now, as long as the Lord was in their midst, what were they able to do? They were able to go back, get those people, bring them back in. God allowed them to dwell somewhat peaceably in the land. He said, this is what I'm promising you. You're not going to have to worry about your enemies. I'm going to take care of them. They're not going to be able to stand against you. Okay? I will give peace in the land, and ye shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. So you're not going to have to worry about those outside of the nation of Israel. And I will cause evil beasts to cease out of the land. Neither shall the sword go through your land. And ye shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall chase 10,000, and your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. Okay, so here he's promised them a harvest, rain in its season. He says, I'm going to give you peace. You're not going to have to worry about your enemies. I'm going to take care of all of that for you. If, once again, going back to the beginning, if what? You keep my commandments, and you obey me. Very no nonsense about what he says. You can't look at this as anything other than an offer of a contract. And it was up to Israel to keep that contract. God made the offer. It's up to them to choose to obey it. And I will have respect unto you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will establish my covenant with you. And you shall eat old store long kept. You shall bring forth the old because of the new. I will set my tabernacle among you. This is another promise that he gives. When it says he will set his tabernacle, what does that mean? My dwelling place. The tabernacle, remember, was the dwelling place of God on this earth. Now, what is our tabernacle? We have a fleshly tabernacle, right? It's our bodies. We are the fleshly tabernacle of God. Under the old law, the fleshly tabernacle was the tent of meeting. He said, I'm going to have my dwelling place among you. Now, was that important? He wasn't a foreign, distant God. He wasn't someone that, he was visiting us a long time ago, and we haven't seen him in 100 years, and, we really don't know. No, he says, my tabernacle, my temple is going to be in your midst. It is going to be eventually in the city of David in Jerusalem. I'm going to dwell amongst you. Is that not important to us as Christians? Do we want our God to dwell amongst us? Yes, absolutely. It was no less important for the Israelites. He said, I'm going to dwell physically in your midst, in that temple of meeting, in that tabernacle, that tent. He says, I'm going to be there. You don't have to worry because I am in your midst. Okay, so continuing on. I will set my tabernacle among you. My soul shall not abhor you. I will walk among you, and this is the important thing. I will be your God, and you will be my people. If, going back once again to the first part of this, if you keep my commandments. Okay? If you keep my commandments, I'll do all of these things. I will be your God, and you will be my people. All right. I am Jehovah your God, who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, that ye shall not be their bondsmen, you will not be in captivity to anyone, and I have broken the bars of your yoke, and I have made you upright. All right. So he promises them all of these things. With the one caveat, the one condition, is that you keep my commandments. Now, those commandments are broken down to a bunch of different ones, but it was all one. It all came under one umbrella, the commandments of God. They had to obey those things in order for this covenant to be in place. If both of us go into a contract and one of us breaks the contract, is there a contract anymore? No. Now, there's remedies for that, but there still is no contract once the contract has been broken. All right? So, he tells them all of these things. He gives them all of these promises. Now, in verse 14 is once again, they have a choice. God's given them the offer. It's theirs to take or refuse. And at any time they can take or refuse it. But if they refuse it, then he's going to do something. If they take that contract, he's going to do something for them. So if in the absence of not obeying and not keeping the laws, not keeping the commandments, what does he say? Verse 14. But, Three-letter word that, man, it has so many connotations. But if ye will not hearken unto me, or listen to me, draw near to me, if you will not hearken to me and will not do all of these commandments, you notice he didn't say, if you'll do everything but these, if you'll do everything but these, if you'll do everything but these, he says, if you will not do all of my commandments. He didn't give them the option of picking and choosing the ones that they decided to do. Does that sound like the world today? I'm happy to obey this, but this offends me. I don't think this is right. This may have been culturally appropriate back then, but it's not today. That's not what he says. You must obey all of my commandments. In the same way today, we're under the law of Christ. And believe it or not, under the law of Christ, we have commandments. Whether we want to accept them or not, we have commandments. But much in the same way, God's given to us a contract, and it's up to us whether we're going to pick and whether we're going to obey it or not obey it, whether we're going to accept it or not accept it. But in the absence of not accepting it, here's what he says I'm going to do. If you will not hearken to me and will not do all these commandments, let's step back for one moment. Remember what we said, the children of Israel were vomited out of the land. Why were they vomited out of the land? There's a reason. They were set in captivity for a period of time. Why was that? Why were the years of that captivity specific? What had to happen? What was the commandment? What was the problem? You remember? It's been a couple of weeks ago, so if anybody doesn't remember, I understand. Well, what were they supposed to do with the land? The physical land. Exactly. It was a Sabbath year. Every seventh year was a Sabbath year. The land was supposed to remain fallow. They weren't supposed to till it. They weren't supposed to cultivate it. They weren't supposed to do anything. Now remember, if they did that, God said, back up here in verse 3, if you'll do all of my commandments, which includes the Sabbath year for the land, what is he going to do? Are they going to go hungry when they didn't plant? No. He says, if you'll keep my commandments, including the Sabbath year for the land, I'm going to make sure you eat. As a matter of fact, you're going to have an abundance. You're not going to have to worry. The problem was the children of Israel conveniently forgot. A lot of times it's greed. If you've got a farmer and he can a lot of crops and he can make a lot of money, he's going to plant that land whether God tells him to not plant it or not. And that's what was happening. They weren't observing the Sabbath for the land. He says, so I'm going to cast you out, and you're not going to come out until all of the Sabbaths of the land are fulfilled. So many years had to go by in order for the children of Israel to come back. That land was going to remain fallow because there was nobody in the land to cultivate it. So when he says all of my commandments, did he mean all of his commandments? He didn't say forget about the Sabbath year. He said all of my commandments. So this is what he's going to do. And if your soul abhor mine ordinances, so that you will not do all my commandments, but break my covenant. So that tells us another thing. When we don't obey his commandments, we've broken the covenant. God will never break the covenant, ever. The first breaking of that always comes from us, not from God. If we do what we're supposed to do, our part is done, then God will do his part. If we don't do our part, we've broken the covenant. God didn't do it. A lot of times, well, I don't know where God, I don't know where God is. God is where he has always been. It's up to us. Where are we? We measure ourselves in our proximity from God, not how far God's gone away from us, but how far we've gone away from God. Okay, continuing on. But you break my commandment, I also will do this unto you. Now, he starts enumerating some things, and we think how horrible these are, because he talks about some awful things that are going to happen to the children of Israel if they don't keep his commandments. But remember, it was always within their decision to obey or not to obey. But he's telling them in advance, if you won't obey my commandments, these are the things that are going to happen to you. And once these are done, if you will not obey me, if you will not come back to me, if you will not continue in my covenant, then these are going to happen. And you notice that the progression of them gets steadily worse. The nation of Israel didn't start out, he didn't say, I'm going to utterly destroy you off the bat. He said, I'm going to chastise you, and then I'm going to rebuke you, and then I'm going to discipline you, and then eventually I'm going to cause you to be vomited out of the land. Expelled out of the land. All right? These are the things that are going to happen to you if you will not obey. I will appoint terror over you, even consumption and fever. So here we see where before there was not going to be sickness and pestilence in the land. Here he says, I'm going to appoint terror over you, even consumption and fever, that shall consume the eyes and make the soul to pine away. Then he says, and you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. So in these outlying lands where these farmers were building these crops, what were happening? These raiding parties from outside of the land of Israel were coming in, carrying away the workers, carrying away the harvest, and taking the food that they had worked so hard to cultivate and to grow and to harvest. Their enemies were going to come and they were going to take it away. You think the enemies of God were laughing as they did this? Absolutely. We got one over on these children of this Jehovah. They were laughing about it. It was a mockery. All right? So continue on. He says, you shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it, and I will set my face against you. Now, see, this is a concept that I don't think we really, maybe have not thought that much of. The idea of setting our face against somebody. What is that? Somebody give me an idea about what does he mean by that? What's the concept behind that? I will set my face against you. He was certainly he was going to allow things to happen to them that he would not have allowed before. While he may not have sent those raiding parties, he was not going to stop it from happening. When you set your face against something, it means that your countenance is no longer what it once was. Before, his countenance was going to prevent. His countenance was against their enemies coming in. Now his countenance is allowing their enemies to come in and do these things. He had changed. It changed his viewpoint towards his children of Israel. They were no longer in obedience, so he was no longer their protector. So I've set my face. He said, I will set my face against you, and ye shall be smitten before your enemies. They that hate you shall rule over you, and ye shall flee when none pursueth you. Now, not to get into every single aspect of the history of the children of Israel, but time and time again, people from outside of the nation of Israel came in and had rule over them, even early on in the kingdom. They were set up as governors and satraps and provincial rulers, people from outside of the land of Israel. They were outside of the covenant of God, and these men were coming in, and they were having the rule because their kings were wicked, and they allowed it to happen. They had marriages of convenience, and sometimes that would allow people to come in that were in charge of them that should not have been in charge of them. And this is what's occurring, okay? So, you shall be smitten, they that hate you shall rule over you, and ye shall flee when none pursueth you. And if you will not for these things hearken unto me, then I will chastise you 7 more times for your sins. I'm going to perfect my rebuke. I'm going to perfect it. I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heaven as iron, and your earth as brass, and your strength shall be spent in vain, for your land shall not yield its increase. Now, right before this, he had promised that the land will give its increase. If you don't obey me, the land will not give its increase. Neither shall the trees of the land yield their fruit. Okay. So the idea of 7 times more, 7-fold, not necessarily, you understand the concept of that numerology, the 7 being perfection, and that's what it is. He's perfecting his rebuke and his chastisement of the people. Okay. Now, verse 21, we'll just finish this real quick. And if you walk contrary to me and will not hearken unto me, I will bring 7 times more plagues upon you, or 7-fold more plagues upon you according to your sins. I will send the beasts of the field among you, which shall rob you of your children, and shall destroy your cattle, and will make you few in number, and your ways will become desolate. Okay? So the punishments are becoming more and more severe as they continue to remain outside of a covenant relationship with God. Continue on verse 23. And if by these things, even if after all of these occur, you will not be reformed unto me, you will not come back to me, you will not return to me, but will walk contrary to me. So that tells us if we're not walking with God, what are we doing? Walking away from Him, against Him. Okay? All right. But will walk contrary unto me, then I will also walk contrary to you and will smite you. You know, I don't want to be smitten. Smitten is not a good thing. When God smites us, it's not a good thing. And this is what He's promised them. I will smite you, even I, 7 times for your sins, 7-fold. I will bring a sword among you, or upon you, that shall execute the vengeance of the covenant. You shall be gathered together within your cities. I will send the pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered unto the land of the enemy. When I break your staff of bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven. And they shall deliver your bread again by weight, and ye shall eat and not be satisfied. The food's not going to be there. 10 women are going to be able to prepare all the food they have for their family. They're going to be able to prepare it in one oven. He's kind of giving us a metaphor about what's going to happen. This is a metaphor for despair, hunger, starvation. The crops are not going to be there. The food's not going to be there. And you read about many times the land of Israel was besieged by enemy forces. At one point, Jerusalem was cut off, and they said, we read about that in the Bible where it talks about the food was so so expensive nobody could afford it. They were eating bird dung because they were so hungry. What was one of the things that would have been unthinkable to the children of Israel, but they actually had to engage in? Cannibalism. They actually had to eat their infant children. The sick, the dying, they had to eat human flesh in order to survive because their own fault. This is not God being a capricious God. He wasn't playing around with them. He says, I'm going to do this to you so that you'll come back to me. And as soon as you come back to me, what was going to happen to those things? They'd go, all the bad things would go away. Every time they came back to him, he restored them. He took away their enemies. He brought back the fields. He brought back the increase. All they had to do was return to him, and he would return them to a state of being their God and them being his people. Unfortunately, in spite of all of this, they still continue to run contrary to God. All right. Verse 27, and if you will not for all this hearken unto me, but walk contrary unto me, then I will walk contrary unto you in wrath. And I also will chastise you sevenfold for your sins. You shall eat the flesh of your sons, and the flesh of your daughters shall ye eat. Literally. And I will destroy your high places, cut down your sun images. What are those? Places of worship to idols, pagan worship that they had engaged in. I will cut down all these things. They weren't supposed to have any image of anything under the sun or in the heavens. And here they're worshiping the sun. They're worshiping sun gods. They're putting up places of worship that they're not supposed to be there. All of these things, he says, they will be destroyed. Whether you destroy them on my behalf or I have to destroy them, that's what's going to happen. All right? And I will cast your dead bodies upon the bodies of your idols, and my soul shall abhor you. I will make your cities a waste. But all we have to do is look at what happened to Jerusalem. When Nebuchadnezzar came through and utterly destroyed Jerusalem, tore down the gates of the city and the walls of the city, and there it was, laid waste. That beautiful city of Zion is now destroyed. They had to build it piece by piece. I will make your cities a waste and will bring your sanctuaries unto desolation, and I will not smell the savor of your sweet odors. So even then, when they're worshiping and they're offering up these sacrifice, does God accept it as a sacrifice? Was God saying, well, they've done all these other things, but at least they're still sacrificing to me? What was his attitude towards their sacrifice when they were in disobedience? No. In much the same way, when we come to worship, when we're here in worship, and our hearts are away from him, our hearts are far from him, and we do not stand righteous in his sight, does he accept our worship? No. We might as well not be here if that's the best we can do. Our hearts have to be to him. Our hearts have to be close to him in order for him to accept our worship. We don't have that kind of worship. Our worship is in spirit and in truth. Okay? So, he says, I will not smell the savor of your sweet odors, that sacrifice that you offer up. I will bring the land unto death. Getting back to that, I want you to think about how ridiculous this sounds. The children of Israel honestly believed, or dishonestly believed, intellectually dishonest, believed that they could do all of these other things. They could worship the sun, they could worship all of these different idols of all of the areas around them, but that they could still offer up sacrifice in the form of blood sacrifice to God, and God would accept it. Do you think about how illogical that is? Today we would think that's absolutely ridiculous. There's no way that they could do something like that. But sometimes do we not find ourselves engaging in the same type of behavior? We are running contrary to God, and we still believe that we can show up to worship. We could sit in the congregation. We could sit with our brothers and sisters in Christ. We can worship, and somehow it's different for the Israelites than it is for us. God will listen to me. I'm under the law of Christ. The same rules apply. We have to be in the right relationship with God in order for him to accept our worship as that sweet savor. But we look at them and think, how ridiculous is that they would believe that? Oh, that's just insane. Why did they think they could do that? But then we end up doing the same thing. I'm going to do everything I want to do, but then God will accept my worship. That's the same thing. Okay? So it shows they're being very illogical in the way they're doing things. Continuing on. I will bring the land into desolation, and your enemies that dwell therein shall be astonished at it. Yeah. Even the people outside of Israel, when they saw the destruction that occurred in the carrying away of when Nebuchadnezzar came and assaulted the land and carried everybody away, those outside said, I thought Israel, this was God's country. This was Jehovah. I mean, they're astonished that God would allow these things to happen to his children. They will be astonished at it, and you will I scatter among the nations, and I will draw out the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. All right. So we've got two choices, right? He's given them these two options. If you'll obey my commandments, I'm going to give you everything that you need. If you don't, then I'm going to take away everything that you need, and I'm going to give you worse. So logically, what would we choose? Logically. Okay. Do we want that stuff? Yeah. I mean, God's promised it. I want what God's promised. I'm going to do what is necessary. Why do you think it took so little time for the children of Israel to go so far astray? What's that? Why do you think it took so little time for the children of Israel to go so far off the tracks? I mean, it was not a very long period of time before they had gone off into a complete rejection of God and his authority. It didn't take very long. I mean, they were doing this even under the days of the judges, not just in the kings, but in the days of the judges. The children had wandered away from where they were supposed to be. They saw something they wanted, right? It was lust. The same lust that occurs to every man and woman. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life. Everything that they saw they wanted, they did. They did what was right. Remember, it says in those days, every man did what? What was right in his own. Let me tell you, when you have that, when somebody says something like that they did what was right in their own sight, can you not infer from that they were doing something that was contrary to God? Yeah, you don't even have to be told that. You can make that assumption strictly by listening to it. When it says that they did what was right in their own eyes, you can know pretty much without a doubt that they were doing what they did that was right in their own mind and their own eyes was contrary to what God had told them in his commandments. We kind of know that just by hearing the words that are coming out of the mouth. Okay, so in finishing this up, the idea in verse 34, it talks about, you will be carried away, you will be taken into a land, I will disperse you amongst the nations until the land enjoys its Sabbaths, then I will allow you to go back home. That's exactly what happened. The children of Israel were taken away, they were carried into captivity until the land enjoyed its Sabbaths, which was one of the most important things that he said for them to do, and they would not do it. So he said, if you won't do it on purpose and intentionally, then I will cause it to happen. But the land will enjoy its Sabbaths, whether you say it or not. It's going to happen. Now, see, it would have made a whole lot more sense had they just said, you know what? It's the seventh year, guys. You know what we're supposed to be doing. Now, you know that there were probably some who did that. There were likely some who were faithful and said, listen, this is a Sabbath year. I'm not going to plant my crops. I'm going to trust in God. God has always had a remnant of people who are faithful to him in every situation. Always have been. So there were likely some, but were they not punished along with those who were guilty? Yeah. God didn't make any distinction. He said, the land will enjoy its Sabbaths. You will be carried away, and I will allow you to return when the land has enjoyed its Sabbaths, and then you'll get to come back. But it would have made a whole lot more sense had they just done what God told them to do. He wasn't asking something unreasonable. Because if they did that, you don't have to worry about it. You're gonna eat. As a matter of fact, you're going to have plenty. You're not going to have to worry about it. Is it always easier to do what God tells us to do? Do we not? Sometimes we feel that it's not at the time, don't we? Is that true? Sometimes, when the situation actually occurs, sometimes we tell ourselves, listen, it's not easy. And we think that way. It's not easy for me to obey. This is not easy for me to do. But then when we look at the long-term effects of not obeying, was it easier in the first place to obey? Like the idea of admitting wrong, admitting sin. In the short term, it's easier to just wash your hands of it and say, not admit it, not confront it, not do anything. And in the short term, yeah, I can avoid short-term punishment. I can avoid short-term effects of admitting sin and admitting my problems and admitting my mistakes, my shortcomings. But in the long run, when you look down the road, wasn't it easier to admit it in the first place and take care of it when it happened? It's the same thing with Israel, I think. It would have been so much simpler had they just done what he told them to do as they were going. But in the end, you think about people that they were innocent and they were carried away in all of this. So we need to think about that when we think about how hard it is, we think it is in the short term to do what God wants us to do. So he pulls them away and he says, you're not going to come back as long as the Sabbaths remain undone. As long as the land enjoys its Sabbaths, I'll allow you to come back in, and that's exactly what happens. And real quickly, in verse 40, and then we'll jump into 27 real quick. There's just a few things there. Verse 40, and they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, in their trespass which they trespassed against me, and also that, because they walked contrary to me, I also walked contrary to them and brought them into the land of their enemies. He's speaking here of the children of Israel going into captivity, into the land of Babylon. This is what he's speaking of here. He says, they brought them into the land of their enemies. If then their uncircumcised heart be humbled, then they accept of the punishment of their iniquity. They don't remain proud. Their hearts are humbled. They realize the error of their ways, and they come back to me. Then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember. And I will remember the land. The land also shall be left by them, and shall enjoy its Sabbaths, while it layeth desolate without them, and they shall accept of the punishment of their iniquity, because they had rejected mine ordinances, and their souls abhorred my statutes. So in spite of all of that, in spite of all the things you're doing, the land is going to enjoy its Sabbaths, but then I will remember my covenant. And yet for all that, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them. It's interesting because in the land of their enemies, the Israelites still prospered. They still grew. They still enjoyed all of the things that they were promised. They were not allowed to live in the land that they had been promised. They still managed to make a pretty good go of it, even in the land of their enemies. He says, I will not reject them, neither will I abhor them, to destroy them utterly and to break my covenant with them. For I am Jehovah, their God, but will for their sakes remember the covenant of their ancestors, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am Jehovah. In verse 46, it sums it up. It says, this is your choice that you have to make. This is what happens when you do it. This is what happens when you don't. And it all sums it up here. These are the statutes and ordinances and laws which Jehovah made between him, God, and the children of Israel in Mount Sinai by Moses. All right, any questions about chapter 26? And we'll real quick go through chapter 27. Anything? I think it's pretty straightforward. You can't accuse God of being vague. You read this, and there's no part of this where you can say, well, I didn't understand what he meant by that. You know, he didn't tell us everything we needed to know. He didn't let us know what was going to happen if we didn't do it. He spells it out for them. He gives them everything they need, and then he spells out what's going to happen if they don't do what he tells them to do. All right, real quickly, chapter 27, and then we will finish this up. All right, we're just going to read a great deal of this, and then we can answer any questions. This is sort of it's not really, it doesn't flow as well as the rest of the book because it's. You think it doesn't get any more of a punctuation mark than saying these are the laws and statutes of Jehovah that I've set, and he kind of brings the whole thing to a final point in chapter 26. But in chapter 27, there's something he feels that he needs to a little bit more that he needs to give them, and this is the redemption of people and the amounts that they were supposed to spend in order to redeem people on the time of Jubilee. And Jehovah spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when a man, I also talked about vows, I apologize, I forgot to say that. When a man shall accomplish a vow, the person shall be for Jehovah by thy estimation. And thy estimation shall be of the male from 20 years old, even unto 60 years old, even of thy estimation. And it talks about the different values that were given to specific people in regards to the accomplishment of a vow that they make to God. I pledge this to God. I'm making a vow before God, and this is just giving an estimation. And I really don't want to get too far into it, because for one thing, this is one of the few things in the book that really doesn't have an equivalent in the New Covenant. We don't do this. Why? why do we not make vows in this particular way and redeem one another? What's the answer for that? Why do we not do that? Who pays our redemption? Who redeems us? Jesus Christ. Can we redeem another person? No. Is there a particular value to give unto one person over another person? No. Not under the new law. Every soul is equally important. And here it gives specific estimations. Male and female are different. Different age groups are different. Under the new law, what are we? There is neither male or female. There's neither Jew or Greek. There's no longer slave or free, but all are one. We're all equal. We're all the same in the eyes of God now. So this doesn't have as much of an equivalation or equivalency in the new law, but it's something that he felt was necessary. And it does give, once again, gives very specific things. And it shows the fairness of God. It shows the fairness of God, all right? And it goes into all these things. And if it be a female, then it's 30 shekels. And if it's a male in a certain age, it's 20 shekels. And for the female, 10 shekels. Now, understand this. A lot of people say, you see, God's giving preference to men over women. That's not what this means. This estimation went by the amount of work that was actually able to be done, physical labor that was able to be done. You'll notice that men over 60, they're not given as much estimation because they can't perform as much work. But from 20 years old to 50, when you're kind of at your strongest and you're able to do the most, that's the estimation that was given the most. Okay? So it doesn't mean that God favored men more than women. He said that they're capable of more physical work, and that's how that estimation was given in regards to redemption from a vow. All right? So that's all that means. In verse 9, and if it be a beast whereof men offer an oblation to Jehovah, an offering to God, all that any man giveth of such unto Jehovah shall be holy. He shall not alter it nor change it. That sounds pretty applicable to us today. We don't alter or change our worship. We give it to God, and it's God's. He shall not alter it or change it, a good for a bad or a bad for a good. And if he shall at all change beast for beast, then both it and that for which it was changed shall be holy. And if it be any unclean beast, of which they do not offer an oblation unto Jehovah, then he shall set the beast before the priest, and the priest shall give a value to it. Whether it be good or bad, as the priest valueth it, so shall it be. But if he will indeed redeem it, then he shall add the fifth part thereof unto any estimation. Once again, a lot of very specific, what we would call today legalese. You know, there's a lot of fine print under the old law. Would you agree? A lot of fine print. This must be this, and if this is not this, then this must be substituted, and all of these things. I'm thankful that we live under a law where there's no fine print. There's no fine print under the law of Christ. It's all very, it's a very generalized law as opposed to very specific law. Everything that we give to God is holy. Anything God gives to us is holy. I'm no better than someone older or younger than myself. I'm no better than a woman. Both of us are estimated equally in the eyes of God. Because of no matter what the difference is between me and anybody, God does not look at us differently. Age, class, socioeconomic status, education, gender, it does not matter. We're all equal under the eyes in the eyes of God in the law of Christ. I'm thankful for that, because under the old law that was not always the case. But now we don't have to worry about that. God values us all equally. Christ died for the sins of all, not for the sins of a few people, for every single person, and we're all equal under the law of Christ. All right. Verse 14, real quick. And when a man shall sanctify his house to be holy unto Jehovah, then the priest shall estimate it, whether it be good or bad. Then the priest shall estimate it, so shall it stand. So it gives a lot of leeway to the priest. If you would bring something and you would make it stand it before the priest gives the estimation, and that's the end of it. It's kind of like a final ruling in a sports contest, right? You know, when the umpire or the referee makes a call, that's where it is. You know, leave it alone. And you think about how much more important it was under the law than it is under a sports contest. You know, the priest makes a determination, leave it alone. That's how it's going to be. Which means when the priest makes an evaluation, does God accept that valuation? Yeah, that was his job. If the priest values it, so God values it, and whatever that is. Okay. Any questions? All of this goes down to the idea about the things that were offered up, whether it was a person, whether it was an animal, whether it was a dwelling, whether it was the tithe of the land, any of that, all of that had a specific valuation that God gave to it. And if that valuation was incorrect, then the priest gave the valuation to it, all in redemption of a particular vow. That's really what 27 comes down to. I don't want to beat that horse. Any questions? Congratulations. We finished the book of Leviticus.